James chapter number 1. And verse number 2. James chapter 1 verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. And then verse 12. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. So I want to speak this morning on the subject of responding right when life goes wrong. Responding right when life goes wrong. One of the hardest realities that every believer, I think, faces after they get saved and start following Christ is that living right doesn't always guarantee that everything's going to go right. Kind of have that expectation for some reason, but that's not the case. Salvation doesn't exempt us from trouble by any means. Faith doesn't insulate us from the pains or life itself. Walking with God doesn't mean that the road's going to be smooth from now on. Life doesn't simply just go wrong because God has lost control. It goes wrong because we live in a very fallen, sinful world, and it is part of life. James opens up this epistle in a way that kind of surprises us with his very first exhortation here in verse number 2, telling his brethren to count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. So he doesn't begin with encouragement or promises or any assurance of comfort. He starts off with trials, with temptations, with burdens. The word temptations there means a proving experience. It means adversity, and what we would refer to as a trial or a test. Notice carefully, James does not say, count it all joy if ye fall into diverse temptations. He says, count it all joy when you fall. So it's a certain thing that we in our Christian life are going to face trials, and they are to be expected. No doubt. Bradley, you mind shifting over a little bit? I can't see your mama. And she needs this message real good. No, I'm kidding. I just like to be able to see everybody. All right, thank you. So some trials in life, they come on us all of a sudden like. We never expected them, never saw them coming. Some trials can come and they can last much longer than we care for them to. They can go on quite some time. Some of the trials we go through and we make it through, and we can look back and we can see how God was working and what God was doing. But that's not always the case. Some trials that we go through in life, we are not going to know what God's purposes are for them this side of eternity. It's just the way things are. But every believer, no matter how faithful, no matter how mature, and no matter how surrendered they are, will always face in life some unexpected hardships, some painful disappointments, some seasons of pressure and trials that really stretch our faith and patience and endurance. But James directs us here in this verse 2, as he opens up this letter to these believers, he directs us to a much more important question than why does the trial come? He poses the question and puts it before us as to how am I to respond when the trial comes. In the Christian life, if you've looked and observed for very long, you're going to see that many people go through the same type trials. The same trial that deepens and grows one believer, it ends up being the very thing that causes someone to drop out. The same pressure that strengthens someone's faith will also sour it in others. I can't help but think about a good example would be Job and his wife. They went through a lot of issues. They went through the storms. They lost their business. They lost their children. And they responded differently, though. Job's was not going to give up his integrity. He was not going to turn his back on God. Whereas his wife said, Job, just curse God and die. Get this over with. So they both went through a lot of the same things, but they responded differently. And the difference is not in the trials themselves, but it is in the response. Trials, though they come, do not automatically produce spiritual growth in us. Time does not mature all believers. Surviving painful difficulties doesn't sanctify us by itself. Only a right response to them can. It's true that God uses trials as a tool to grow us and mature us. But Satan likes to take those same trials and use them as a trap to embitter us and turn us away from God. So that what God had meant for good becomes the very thing that Satan uses to break us down. So James is writing here to teach us how to respond rightly when life goes wrong. Because trials themselves do not define us. Our response to them does. So let's look at his admonition here. He says, my brethren, and the first thing we notice right off is this command to count it all joy. So the point here is the command that seems unnatural. When you just read this and say, count it all joy, when you fall into trials, you almost laugh out loud, don't you? You think, oh wow, how can you do something like that? It sounds unreasonable and almost offensive until we really understand what James is telling us here and saying that we need to do. God's not minimizing our trials. They're not something to laugh at as we would think. But He is clarifying how we are to process trials when they come. Several things about this command that we should note here. First of all, it was my brethren. James is clearly speaking to saved people and those who belong to Christ. And the command is for those who are saved. People in the world have no biblical framework whatsoever for processing suffering. Lost people see pain and trials as something that's random, something that is pointless, cruel, and even unfair. But believers know something different, that trials are not accidents. They are divine appointments by God. God expects His children to respond to trouble in their life in a way that reflects their trust in Him. And this command reminds us that our reactions do matter. Our testimony is on display and our faith is being observed by others. The Christian life is not measured by how we act when everything is going right, but by how we respond when everything seems to be going wrong. The command, count it all joy. That is not a command for believers to feel happy about their pain, but rather He's commanding us here to think rightly about our trial. The word count is an accounting term. It means to reckon, to evaluate, and to consider carefully. It means to come to a deliberate conclusion. This is a command of our mind, for our mind. It's a command on how we are to think about trials. It is not a command for our emotions, not to dwell on how we feel because of the trial. We are to count, to reckon. Joy here is not laughter. It is confidence. It is calm delight. It's a settled trust in God's purposes. You do not rejoice as in laugh about the trial. You rejoice through the trial because you know that God is at work. Count it all joy is choosing to believe that even though this trial is here, that God is still good, that God is still wise, that God is still in control, even when all the circumstances are saying otherwise. Faith doesn't deny that there is pain, but it refuses to deny God because of the pain. Trials are certainly unexpected and unavoidable. As I mentioned, it says, when ye fall, not if. This conveys to us that the fall comes suddenly, that you're going to be surrounded or to be overtaken with these trials. Trials are rarely planned for. They ambush us, don't they? They interrupt our plans and our lives in ways that's very disrupting. They knock the breath out of us or pull the rug out from under our feet. And James says these are divers temptations, many kinds, many pressures. The word divers there means diverse temptations. So this is a broad statement on how to deal with any trial that comes. It could be physical ailments. It could be financial woes or setbacks. It can be emotional issues or relationship issues, and even spiritual struggles going on in your heart. No believer is exempt, and no season of life is immune. The right response begins when we stop resenting the trial and start recognizing God's hand in it. And that is so very important, that we think about our trials in this manner. Counting it all joy is a choice that has to be made by faith. Everything in us resists this command. We don't want to do it. Our flesh says, no, don't count it all joy, complain. Don't sit there and count it joy. Go into panic mode. Get anxiety over this. Withdraw from your normal routines of life. Become bitter about what's taking place. But faith cries out and says, trust God through this. Stand firm and faithful. Stay obedient to God. Believe His Word and trust Him. Counting it all joy is not pretending that everything is fine, but rather it is refusing to believe that the trial is meaningless and without purpose. We do not choose the trials that we face in life. God does that for us. But what we do choose is how we respond to those trials. And that choice will determine whether a trial becomes a tool for growth in our life or whether it becomes a trap of discouragement to get us out of the race. Now, if James stopped right here in verse number 2 and giving us this command that is so unnatural to us, it would sound unreasonable. So James immediately tells us why this command makes sense and why it is that we should obey this command. He shows us that God is not wasting our suffering at all, and that every trial is working something in us that a life of comfort without this trial can never bring. So look at verse 3. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. James wants us to know that trials are not just random events in our Christian life, but they are part of a process that God is continually working in us. He starts off by saying why we can obey, count it all joy, by knowing this. This phrase is very critical. God wants us to know that He is up to something. And a responding right to the trial, you're gonna have to know and accept and understand that God has a process that He's going through in this trial, that He is working. If you just simply believe that trials are random, you're gonna grow resentful. If you believe and are convinced that trials are pointless, there's no purpose in it, you're going to grow discouraged. But if you know that trials are purposeful from God, you can endure them. He wants you to know several things. He wants you to know that trials are a test and not punishment. That the trying of your faith. How often do we think when things get difficult, God's punishing me? I've done something, what have I done wrong? And we start being concerned about that situation. But it is not necessarily punishment that is coming. It's the trying of your faith. God's working on your faith. The word trying means to test, to examine, to prove something as being genuine. It's the word used for testing metals by fire. Fire doesn't create gold, it only reveals it and purges it and purifies it. God is not punishing His children in the midst of trials. If it is your heart's desire to live for God and serve God, why would God punish you? Let me tell you that all the punishment and judgment for our sin was poured out on Jesus Christ back there at Calvary on the cross.
Right.
And anything that God does in our life is not punishment and judgment of sin. Jesus paid for even our future sins' punishment. Now God will correct, but the punishment of our sin was put upon Jesus Christ. So God is not punishing us for our wrong. Trials are not God's anger being unleashed. They are God's testing and His proving. He is not trying to destroy our faith. He is trying to simply expose it and reveal it. A faith that has never been tested is a faith that has never been proven. And He wants you to know that trials are a test. And He also wants you to know what's really in your own heart. Just like a test in school, the testing of our faith doesn't add any knowledge or develop something new within us. It just exposes what is already there on the inside. When pressure comes, it reveals whether our faith is real or superficial, whether trust in God is deep or shallow, and whether obedience is based on condition or whether it has been settled. And just like a sponge, when it is squeezed, reveals what is soaked up inside. When trials squeeze a believer, whatever's inside is going to come out. Trials are very revealing. If the trial squeezes out fear, it reveals misplaced trust in our hearts. Sometimes when trials squeeze us, anger comes out, revealing unmet expectations or unrealistic expectations. But if trials squeeze us and faithful endurance comes out, that tells us our faith is genuine. Now God already knows what's in there, but we often do not. We often get the misconception that everything's going good, that I have arrived. We may not say it, but in our heart of hearts, in our subconscious, we probably do many times. But trials show us what still needs work and the areas that we need to grow. God wants us to know what's in our heart. God wants us to know that He is producing patience in us. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Patience here is not what we normally think of the word patient. Patient, we say someone's not patient, means they're not willing to wait, is what we assume. But that's not what it means. It does not mean waiting quietly. Patience is not passively just sitting. It is an active endurance. It means to endure or continue under pressure. It means to remain steadfast when relief doesn't come. It means to have faith that is obedient while suffering continues. God is not primarily interested in making our lives easier. He's interested in making our lives stronger. Comfort rarely builds character. Ease rarely deepens faith. If someone wants to build up their muscles, they can only do that by weights or resistance of some form. When you remove the weight, the muscle weakens. And likewise, faith grows when it is exercised by trials. God wants you to know that the trial is working whether you see it or not. James says the trial worketh patience. That means something's going on. Even when nothing feels like it's changing or improving, patience, we must know, is not developed overnight. It is formed very slowly, through much waiting, through experiencing unanswered prayers, through repeated pressure, through maintaining obedience. God always works in us long before He ever works through us or around us. And you may not see immediate results, but rest assured, God is producing something permanent in your heart and life. So we understand that God is working a process and trials are a part of it. But James points out that there is a great danger here in verse number 4, that the process only works if we allow it to. So now we see the danger of resisting the process. Look at verse 4. He admonishes them and says, "But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." The verse reveals a truth that many of us overlook, that trials can fail to produce what God intended the trial to produce. Not because God is at fault, but because we resist what God is doing. We're not submitting to it. We are not yielding to it. And God's work in the trial is intentional, but He is not going to force it. God's working requires our cooperation. But let patience have its perfect work. We have to let it. The word "let" there is crucial. It implies permission, surrender, and cooperation. We've got to surrender to what it is God is allowing this trial to produce in our life. God produces this patience, but we must allow it to do that work. Trials are unavoidable, but growth from a trial is optional. We cannot stop the trial, but we can stop the process that God is trying to achieve. And God's process cannot complete its intended work if we are continually resisting and fighting against it. God is working, but we often resist the development of endurance or patience by trying to escape the trial too quickly. Always looking for the fastest way out instead of the right way through. Many times we end up complaining instead of trusting, murmuring about the trial. Murmuring keeps us focused on the pain instead of God's purpose. Many people resort to medicating their pain, using distractions, entertainment, busyness, or even sinful coping mechanisms and addictions they will turn to in the midst of difficult times, like drink or drugs or whatever it may be. Some sinful habit. Trying to force relief before God's finished refining us. A perfect example of this was Israel coming out of Egypt, going into the Promised Land. They were delivered out of Egypt rather quickly, went down to Mount Sinai, got the law and 10 commandments, and made their way up to the border of the Promised Land, ready to go in, all in the matter of weeks. But there it was, and I preached about it not long ago, about hard lesson to learn is believing God's promise. And they would not believe God's promise. They looked at the giants. They said, "No, we're fearful." God was trying to build their faith. But no, they wouldn't have it. They resisted following God and what God was doing in their life. And they're the perfect example of that, and what should have been a short journey of a few weeks ended up being a long trial for 40 years. Imagine. James implies that patience has a perfect work, and that means the trial has an intended end and result. And when we resist, the trial will linger. The pressure may even increase greater. Or God may repeat the lesson again. But God does not waste suffering, and He does not graduate us early from what we refuse to learn. The fastest way through a trial is to let patience have its perfect work. God's goal is maturity. That's said in this verse, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. James defines God's purposes for trials very clearly. The word perfect means spiritual maturity. The word entire, that you may be entire or complete, well-rounded, stable. Wanting nothing or lacking no spiritual development. Why is God doing this? Why are we growing up? Why are we becoming stable and well-rounded? Why are we being equipped? Because God has a work for us to do. God has a plan and a purpose for something coming next. He's not merely trying to get you through the trial. He is preparing you for what's coming in the future. God uses trials to develop believers that become very steady under pressure. Believers who are not controlled by their emotions. Those who are grounded in the truth. And those who are dependable and faithful. Comfort produces consumers. But trials produce soldiers. Remember Paul's admonition to Timothy. Endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. There are no shortcuts. Becoming spiritually mature requires a certain amount of time under pressure. Patience cannot do its work overnight. Spiritual maturity is not instant. It is forged in the furnace of afflictions. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. So how do we cooperate with God in this trial? How do we let Him? Well, we stay obedient even though we may be discouraged. We guard our attitude and not allow bitterness to come in. We submit any kind of timeline that we may have, that this needs to be over by this time. No, we need to submit that to God. God, you make it last as long as it takes to accomplish what it is you're trying to accomplish. We ought to ask God for wisdom. And in fact, that is the very next thing. Verse 5, notice, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Hey, listen, that verse in context is speaking about why God is allowing this trial to come in your life. And if you don't know, then you can pray and ask God, give me wisdom as to what it is you're doing with this trial, and God will grant you that wisdom. He will show you what it is and why it is He is doing. You do not mature by avoiding trials. Refuse to take any kind of sinful shortcut. You mature by enduring them the right way. Now, at this point, some of you might say, well, is all this enduring stuff you're talking about, is this really worth it? Well, James answers that question over there in verse 12 when he talks about the crown for enduring well. Verse 12, blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love Him. Trials in this life are just temporary. God's rewards are eternal. Eternal. And if enduring trials the right way in this life is going to bring me eternal rewards in the next, it's worth it. It is worth it. Endurance brings God's blessing. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. He doesn't say blessed is the man who avoids trials or the man who escapes from the trials, but blessed is the man who endures them. Endurance means remaining faithful when quitting's much easier, staying obedient when when relief is nowhere in sight, and trusting God when answers are withheld. God's blessing is not attached to comfort, but to faithfulness. Soldiers are not honored for avoiding the battle, are they? But for standing faithful in the battle. Endurance proves our genuineness of faith. The phrase, when he is tried, simply means that once he has been approved, once he has gone through the trial the correct way and proven genuine faith after testing. God's not watching to see if you're going to struggle in the trial. He knows you're going to. He knows that. He is watching to see whether your faith remains anchored in Him. And when circumstances strip away our comfort and our security and our control many times, what remains shows what you truly value. Faith that only works when life works is not really faith at all. Endurance leads us to that promised reward. He shall receive the crown of life. That's not salvation, it's a reward. Salvation's by grace. These rewards are according to our faithfulness. And this crown of life represents God's divine approval of us and an eternal honor. In ancient games, athletes endured these intense training and pain, not for comfort, but for a crown that would fade. Paul spoke of it several times. Believers endure for much more pain than what those athletes did, but it is for a crown that will never fade away, an incorruptible crown. Just remember that God does not forget every prayer that's prayed in the midst of pain, every obedient step that is taken in times of weakness, every act of faith that is exercised under intense pressure will be remembered and rewarded by God. God is keeping a record book. He's writing it down. He's keeping track. This endurance, James also mentions, is motivated by love. It says, which the Lord hath promised to them that love Him. He connects the ability to endure these trials with love. People will endure a lot of hardship for what they really believe or value, and will even sacrifice greatly for the people that they love. Endurance here is not fueled by our willpower alone, but by our affection for God. When love for God is shallow, faith tends to collapse under pressure. But when our love for God is deep, faith holds firm. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. And love expresses itself in obedience, especially in the midst of hardship. God promises will make this present pain we endure very bearable. Endurance is sustained by hope. You may not see the outcome now of the trial, but God sees the reward already prepared. Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians 4:17, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And what feels very heavy and difficult now will one day feel very much worth it when we have the crown of life for enduring temptation. Life will go wrong. Trials will come. Pressure will test every one of us. Our faith will be examined. That much is certain and absolute. But it's only those who endure faithfully that will never be disappointed by God. The question is not if life is going to go wrong for you. The question is, how will you respond when it does? And my prayer is that you will count it all joy, and that you will let patience have her perfect work in your heart and life. Let's pray.